It's time for Basic Wash Control Part 3, and things are gonna get a little wet. Welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor, everybody. Today we're gonna do Basic Wash Control Part 3, the Wet in Wet Wash. Wet in wet washes are where the fun and excitement come in, and if anything is indicative of the mind of watercolor, it's wet in wet techniques, because this is mainly where watercolor paints for you. There's so many places you can use this, and basically when you're doing a flat wash and you're doing a graduated wash, you're doing a type of wet in wet wash that's just very controlled. But a true wet in wet wash is where you just let watercolor go to it. Color into clear, color into color, clear water over a flat wash, and then add color. For those of you who haven't looked at these parts or this series, there's 3 parts. I have a whole playlist down there on watercolor basics, and this is going to go in that playlist. As we do real world examples, I'm going to be referring back to these 3 basic lessons. Very simple, very easy to do, but they're the building blocks of just about all watercolor. And we have more to come. I'm probably going to do dry brush and glazing as 2 more. So this is looking like it's going to wrap up to be a 4 or 5 part series. So let's get out those brushes, let's get out some water, and let's get to work. You can see here that I've painted a swatch of clear water. So first of all, we're just going to do a basic wet in wet wash, and this is wet into clear. Wet into clear water. That sheen right there is important. That tells you that your area is still workable. When that goes flat and loses its glossy sheen, you're going to get some odd things happening. You may get back runs depending on how dry or how wet it is. You might get spotting or lifting. Now, because I have a boundaried square here that I put clear water in. Water in wet and wet washes does not go beyond those edges. So this would be a wet into clear water and wet into a shape. I have it very almost puddle wet. Puddle wet gives you the most movement. See that? This is great if you're doing seascapes or skies. I may go in here and just lift some of this extra water. I'm going to add some red, okay? Dab some red up here. Depending on the paint, sometimes it'll granulate and vein. It's just not ever 100% sure what you're going to get with the wet and wet wash. You kind of know the general look of it, but always keep that wetness control in mind. Eventually, this is going to go out here, some of this blue, which is very faint, it's just going to hit that edge, and you're going to end up with a shape. You can still see there's some sheen, but it's not as wet as it was. But that's okay. It's still, unless you use a lot of water, you're still safe to go in with some heavy pigment. So wet and wet washes are a lot about wetness control and knowing the stages, which you're going to get a lot of movement or you're just going to get some softening. So I'm adding some purple hues up here, and I'm not getting all that fast spreading as I was when it was puddle wet, because it still has a sheen and it's still wet, but it's just enough to just take the pigment and soften it. But as it starts to dry, even when you have a sheen on there, be careful of using too much water. It's going to go in there and it's going to push back. That's called a back run. So that's all part of this Mind of Watercolor experience. Knowing and anticipating what watercolor is going to do. So many ways to use this technique, from simple blending to really dramatic skies. I'm going to wet a much larger area, and if you were doing a sky, for instance, and you didn't want these edges where it came out to the edge of the wetness, you just paint well beyond where your pigment's going to be. Okay, give yourself plenty of room. And go in here Maybe add some grays. Now my wetness is way out here, but I don't want any edges showing after it's dry. So I've taken my water way out there so that this all stays very soft and blends to white. Another very common way of using a wet in wet technique. So let's look at a different way to do this. What I have here is a flat wash that I just suggested as sort of amorphous shape. I don't know, maybe it's a haystack or something out in the field. What I'm going to do is show you just a wet in wet wash over a bone dry flat wash. So that's just another way of combining it. That's clear water that I just added there. I'm going to go back in now with a little bit of sepia. And I'm getting very heavy pigment because I want it to be fairly dark. Now down along here where I made that wash, it's going out and it's creating an edge, and I can even extend that edge with pigment if I want. Out here I've kept my clear water far enough away so this all just blends out to a soft color with some neat little spidery wet and wet effects. So let's do that again. I kind of hooked some of that color in there and it started to bleed in, but you know, those little accidents sometimes work out in watercolor. Again, I'm getting some really nice heavy pigment down in there, and it's just, rather than a smooth graduated wash, it's spidering its way and kind of moving its way up in interesting ways that would be very difficult or contrived if I tried to paint it that way. Mind the watercolor, people. That's what it means. I'm going to do the other shape here. I'm just calling them haystacks. This could be anything but pile of hay before it's been baled. Who knows? Clear water wash. Dabbing some pigment down in the corner here, or down in around my form. Well, that did some neat stuff. I just went. It's because I had a little wetter here than these other ones, and so it just really moved right on up. I'm going to dot some color in over here. This still has some sheen, so it'll soften, but it's not going to move as rapidly. Suggesting some shadows, and I guess it really just looks like a pile of dirt, doesn't it? But you get the idea. I'll show you a different example. This is a wet and wet wash where I've painted down some flat color, but it's still very wet. I'm dabbing in paint, but I'm stroking it here, controlling it like a graduated wash. Drying my brush out allows me to, so I can get a very smooth kind of gradation here. I'm looking at the sheen and to make sure it's all even. Now I'm going to go in here and just dab in places. So it started out with a graduated wash. These techniques really overlap, you know. Graduated wash is a form of wet and wet wash. It's just more controlled. And here I've added some less controlled aspects with a more controlled graduation. And there you go. Well, there are probably as many examples of painting wet and wet washes, combining it with clear water, with flat dry color, with wet color. Just a variety of ways you can do it. This is just really fun to experiment. Okay, well, hopefully that gives you some better ideas of how wet and wet washes work. If you've never tried wet and wet washes, or you're not very familiar, or you've been a little standoffish, I hope this will give you a little bit more boldness to go ahead and try some of those things. And it's just a really fun technique to experiment with. You're just never quite sure what you're going to get. Thanks, guys, so much. I am so proud of my supporters. So glad that you tuned in. So glad that you're listening. If this was a help to you, I hope you'll subscribe. I hope you'll like the video. And we will see you next time.